It was a cool November night in Chicago, Illinois, and the WGN-TV station was running its sports segment. At the helm was sportscaster Dan Rowan, who was in that moment explaining the victory that the Chicago Bears had taken over the Detroit Lions earlier that day. Then, suddenly, the screen went black, and there was silence, until this happened. This is the story of the Max Headroom signal hijacking.
Well, if you're wondering what's happened, so am I.
For 28 seconds, Chicagoans tuned into the WGN station got to witness a man dressed as Max Headroom rock back and forth. And soon enough, only 30 seconds later, the technicians were able to restore order. This unusual event might have even been forgotten, or remained a really esoteric piece of Chicago history had it not happened again later that night. 2 hours later, on the PBS affiliate channel WTTW, during a late-night airing of Doctor Who, a second intrusion took place. This time with sound.
I'll get you a hot drink, miss.
Need some dry clothing.
Jesus. What's the way? I just need a giant master piece for all the greatest world newspaper nerds. My brother is wearing the other one, but it's naughty. What you got footprints on? They're coming to get me.
As far as I can tell, a massive electric shock. He died instantly.
The signal intruders took advantage of the fact they had sound this time, saying all sorts of random things, like claiming that Chuck Swirsky was a, quote, freaking liberal. He also said the New Coke catchphrase and hummed the Clutch Cargo theme song, an animated television show that ran for 1 year between 1959 and 1960.
Catch the wave. Coke.
The intrusion then ended with him being spanked with a fly swatter by a woman partially off-screen. As there was no technician on duty at the affected station, the broadcast was allowed to run unimpeded for nearly 90 seconds, and it only ended because the intruders wanted it to, not because somebody was able to stop it. In the days that followed, the FCC would open up an investigation. At this point, they were familiar with this type of intrusion because a year before the Captain Midnight incident had taken place. This is probably the second most well-known TV hijacking moment, but it wasn't nearly as interesting as this one. Because of that previous intrusion, punishments had been upgraded from a misdemeanor to a felony, and it could carry up to 5 years in prison and a $250,000 fine. Although in this case, an FCC spokesman claimed it could carry up to a year in jail and a $100,000 fine. What's interesting to note is that Captain Midnight had been found with relative ease. In fact, he had been found only days after the hijacking. However, finding the Max Headroom intruder immediately proved itself to be much more difficult. So difficult, in fact, they never actually found him.
The computer that we have running our news from time to time took off and went wild.
In order to find the intruder, there were two important questions they needed to answer. 1. How was the signal hijacked? And 2. From where was it hijacked? And of course, with answering those two questions, they could probably find out who did it as well. Before TV providers switched from analog to digital in 2009, it was technically possible to overpower the signal that the station was broadcasting. But in order to overpower that signal, you would need some really, really high tech, and not something any average person is just going to have laying around the house. It's estimated that brand new equipment necessary for all of this would have cost somewhere in the range of $10,000 or more. A lot of money now, and certainly back in 1987. Though some have pointed out it's possible the equipment was bought secondhand. Regardless, it would have been expensive, and clearly owned by someone who understood the back end of television broadcasting, at least enough to know how to hijack it. The second question to answer was, where exactly was the signal intercepted from? It would have had to have been somewhere in downtown Chicago, specifically located anywhere in between the TV stations and their downtown transmitters, meaning that the intrusion must have taken place somewhere in this area. This did really narrow down the possible areas, but of course the problem still remains: there were no suspects. Unlike the Captain Midnight intrusion, this one actually featured people on screen. Not that that helped a lot, considering that one had a mask on, the other was partially off-screen, and the other one was entirely off-screen. Some investigators noted the background, which seemed to be metallic, like something you would see in a warehouse. In fact, someone who had access to a warehouse for video shooting was evidently a promising lead, but since there was no probable cause, there was no warrant. It also helped our mysterious headroom hijacker that the FCC wasn't interested in knocking on doors and spending a whole lot of time and money on the case, which combined with the lack of evidence meant the trail went cold. As one investigator was quoted, "How are you going to lose sleep over something like that? Nobody dies and there's no damage. Max Headroom wasn't a danger to public safety or to a multi-million piece of equipment." The statute of limitations of the case was only 5 years, so by 1992, whoever did it could have admitted to it with no criminal punishment. But despite that, in the almost 40 years since the incident, nobody has ever fessed up to it. Nobody has come forward and identified themselves or their reasons for doing it. In fact, there doesn't seem to be a genuine reason, other than perhaps for the hell of it. Captain Midnight, the HBO hijacker, had his reasons. He had been protesting HBO raising its prices. Since it's almost been 4 decades, there also exists the real chance whoever was responsible for it is dead, or is no longer in their right mind. We may never know. But this is a well-known mystery, so of course theories and suspects have popped up over the years. So let's go over some of the more interesting ones.
Hi, Max Headroom here with... This is my guest.
Suspect 1, Eric Fournier. Eric has been put forward as a suspect for years. Story goes that Eric, who was living in Indiana at the time, wanted to play a music video for his band, the Blood Farmers, on the hijack signal. But right before they decided to do it, he got cold feet and just went with whatever this is. This accusation is slightly more compelling by the fact that Eric and whoever was in the Headroom mask both display an odd sense of humor and aesthetics. In 1999, Eric would create the character Shay St. John, the backstory of which was that this character was struck by a train resulting in severe face deformities and the loss of both arms and legs, resulting in the mask and prosthetics. Watching the videos, it's clear to see how some people connected Eric to the Max Headroom incident. They both have this surreal and somewhat disturbing feel to them. However, this theory is damaged by the fact that it's highly unlikely that Eric was in Chicago at the time, and as one of Eric's former bandmates pointed out, Eric didn't know anything about video editing when we were in high school. We never made music videos apart from someone maybe videotaping one of our shows. We weren't friends with anyone getting degrees in mass communications and had no access to broadcasting equipment. I think the only time the 4 of us were ever in Chicago together was to see a Pixies concert. Unfortunately, Eric can't confirm or deny any of these rumors, as he would pass away in 2010.
Max! Cornelius Headroom here!
The next set of suspects comes from a 2010 Reddit thread. While normally random people on the internet wouldn't be trustworthy, this thread contained specific information about the local scene that a random person simply wouldn't know. The author of the thread was also confirmed by a news article, so this guy is about as legit as we're going to get for a 40-year-old mystery. The thread goes, "I believe I know who's behind the Max Headroom incident that occurred on Chicago TV in 1987. A bunch of people have been asking me about this lately, so I figured I'd do a core dump AM almost A. What I know about all of it in a nutshell. When I was in my early teens, a number of my friends were into the local freaking/hacking scene. This was suburban Chicago from about 1985 until 1993 or so. They were much older than me, high school and college age, but they put up with me as a sort of novelty, I guess. They liked the fact that I looked up to them as quasi-role models, at least. In any event, I spent countless hours/nights over the ensuing years hanging out with them on local BBSs and dial-up chat systems, and the occasional in-person get-together. Most of them were just casual acquaintances. In most cases, I only knew them by their handle, but a few I knew by name. 2 of the people I knew were brothers. This is the point in the story where you folks aren't going to be happy with me. I still remember what their full names are, but I don't think it's a good idea to share them publicly. There are a couple reasons, ones that I think most fair-minded people would agree with. First, there's the obvious. The FCC may still want to have a little talk with at least one of the brothers, who we'll call Jay, the one I believe was behind it. Secondly, the person who I believe did it, Jay, has moderate to severe autism and at least at the time was being cared for by his brother, who we'll call K. I don't want to disrupt their lives. Thirdly, I don't have complete proof, only a heap of circumstantial evidence. Although I've tried recently to contact them to ask them privately, as a fellow Redditor suggested, with no luck. Anyway, back to our charming childhood story. I know people should be inherently skeptical here, so I'll do my best to provide you with as much in the line of details as I can remember. I hope it's enough to show people that I'm not making up anything here. People who were into the hacking scene back then were basically the same type of people who are into the hacking scene now. Guys who live in their parents' basements, charming, brilliant guys who don't think to bathe often, and often lacking in social skills pretty much across the board. They hang out at Denny's until they're asked to leave. They can quote Monty Python sketches from memory and sleep with J.R.R. Tolkien books under their beds where other guys stash. Despite the lack of good grooming and social skills, there was the occasional party every so often, or at least a get-together at somebody's place. One of these get-togethers was in an apartment in a town called LaGrange, a suburb of Chicago, in the winter of 1987. Kay lived in a shared apartment with his girlfriend along with a roommate, also a fellow hacker, who we'll refer to as M. Kay and his girlfriend lived in one half of the apartment, and M lived in the other half. Jay lived with his parents and never moved out. I believe Jay and Kay were originally from Downers Grove or Darien. Anyway, the 2 rooms of this apartment were separated by a clothesline strung in a doorway and a large rug hung over it. Practically every square inch, with the exception of one corner, was packed with systems working and some apparently not working. I remember how the apartment looked in detail because it was the first time I had ever seen an 80-column screen. It was hot as hell in there too. Anyway, the apartment was located in a rather run-down looking apartment high-rise, maybe 4 to 5 stories tall, located within walking distance of a Pizza Hut. We all walked over and did lunch/dinner there that day. Kay was a quiet guy. Even though he lived in this apartment with his girlfriend, he often took care of his older brother Jay, who still lived at home. The degree of Jay's autism was such that I had doubt he could ever hold down a job, even a part-time job. Jay, despite having fairly severe autism and coming off as basically crazy, was actually kind of funny. His sense of humor was sort of disturbing, sort of sexually deviant in nature. He wasn't very personable, but he was funny. The sort of person that you would feel kind of uncomfortable sitting next to as a kid, but he would grow on you after a while, and you would accept him as one of the group after realizing that his mannerisms were odd, but basically harmless. No eye contact ever, but the dirty jokes were funny, at least to me as a 13-year-old at the time. Although it's circumstantial, this is the first bit of evidence I have. The Max Headroom video features a guy who at one point holds up what appears to be a vibrator or dildo and tosses it out of frame. The end of the video shows a man dressed up like Annie Oakley swatting someone's bare ass with a fly swatter. This is the sort of humor that Jay loved. All of his jokes constantly involve something childish and or sexually deviant. The video, for all intents and purposes, is a perfect reflection of Jay's sense of humor, scattered, nervous, and comically sexually deviant. Jay was at the party in the apartment that afternoon. I didn't talk with him directly. Me and the friend of mine that I was there with didn't really talk to anybody that day. But I did overhear what the others were talking about. They were referring to Jay planning to do something, quote, big over the weekend. I remember that word, big, because it piqued my interest as to what might be considered big by their standards. I later asked them collectively during the dinner we all had at Pizza Hut later that night what they were talking about earlier, what big was. And someone, probably Kay, told me to just watch Channel 11 later that night, as a sort of offhanded suggestion. I did happen to be watching Channel 11 later that night, having forgotten about the whole big conversation earlier that day. I saw it, but I didn't put 2 and 2 together at the time. Jay didn't really talk to people directly. His brother Kay sort of talked for him, but not like an interpreter, more like a person there to rephrase or elaborate on what Jay was talking about. To clear up what he was saying, to speak with him, not for him. Jay was much older than his brother. I remember having a hard time trying to place his age because he dressed very unusually and had very thick, very tinted corrective lenses. In retrospect, I'd say he was probably in his late 20s to early 30s at the time. Again, it was hard to tell. At the end of the night, my friend and I ended up getting a ride home from Jay. I thought it was kind of awkward that the two of us sitting in the back seat said nothing to Jay during the ride home, so I tried to strike up some conversation with him. He never answered any of my questions. He had his own topics he wanted to talk about. What I'm trying to illustrate here is that Jay often jumped around randomly back and forth to different subjects when he talked. He never really kept a clear line of conversation. This brings us to the next bit or two of circumstantial evidence. If you watch the video, the person behind the mask jumps around in exactly the same way as Jay. The problem is, I never spoke with Jay for anything other than that ride home, but the way he spoke was in line with the type of verbal mannerisms of the guy in the mask. Where most people would say in conversation, Jay would say oh in various lengths. Oh if he was struggling to find something to say. On the ride home, we talked about what he did for a hobby. He was very proud of a radio he recently acquired. A police radio that he had hacked to cover practically everything from, quote, whale farts to gamma rays, he said. Which was about the only piece of non-sexual comedy I heard come out of his mouth that afternoon. That's the fourth bit of circumstantial evidence. Jay knew a great deal about not just the broadcast spectrum, but the electronics that underpinned that sort of stuff. By definition, Jay was a broadcast hacker. Here's where my collection of Jay begins to fade. I don't recall under what circumstances I remember first hearing about this part. Jay loved reading newspapers. It was one of his peculiarities, and maybe part of his autism. Specifically, it had to do with him hanging out at convenience stores early in the morning to be there when the papers were dropped off. That's what sealed it for me, that recollection, and the fact that the guy in the mask on the video mentions newspapers repeatedly. It's a minor point, but Clutch Cargo would have also been contemporaneous to Jay's childhood. Clutch Cargo was an early 60s cartoon. Only someone born in the 1950s would have been able to sing the theme song. If Jay was about 30 at the time, 1987, then this would make sense. That's about all I know. To me, the man behind the mask seems for all intents and purposes to be Jay. The brother mentioned in the video is his brother Kay. The woman with the fly swatter is likely Kay's girlfriend, whom I may or may not have ever met. I don't think I did that day. For the record, it's speculation, but I don't think that Jay's butt is getting hit with the fly swatter. I think it was Kay's. I can't see Jay allowing anyone to see him partially naked, let alone being hit with a fly swatter. Only joking about it. That's pretty much all I know.
I'm looking for some atmosphere. Hit it, boys.
Bowie, the original poster, would attempt to get in contact with either of the brothers by email or Facebook, both of which would fail as he never got a reply back. As of 2014, however, he was able to confirm they still live together, but he couldn't confirm if they just didn't want to talk or if his messages were even getting through. But, weirdly enough, a few years later, a new thread by the same user would appear again. This one titled, New Developments in the Max Headroom Incident Mystery. I suppose I should just get right to the meat of it. Some of you who've been following the case might recall that recently we hinted there had been a new development in the case. One that we might have the ability to talk about in the days and weeks ahead. Well, now we've tied up our loose ends on that front and now can share what we know. J and K have been excluded as suspects in the Max Headroom incident. My original theory was incorrect. After the publication of the Motherboard Vice magazine article which talked about the incident, Rick Klein and I agreed to stay in touch with each other. We become friends in the process too, which is kinda cool. But anyway, in the meantime, I occasionally revisited the idea of examining the video-audio end of things in more detail, while Rick continued to interview folks connected with the local radio-television broadcast industry in Chicago at the time. My own efforts were met with some limited success, but Rick's efforts have turned out to be vital. Several weeks ago, Rick and I had the luxury of meeting and speaking with several engineers and technicians who were actively working for WBBM, WTTW, WGN, and other companies in the Chicago broadcasting community at the time. They yielded a wealth of very detailed information, including specifics about what kind of locations, gear, physical access, and more importantly, what sort of station-specific knowledge would have been necessary in order to pull off the intrusions themselves. This was the kind of heavy engineering perspective knowledge that we had only bits and pieces to work with before and had been trying to obtain for some time with great difficulty. After the last round of interviews and having looked at the resulting evidence pile in total, Rick and I have concluded that the possibility of this having been an outside job is basically zero. To make a long story short, all the things which needed to have been possessed by an outside amateur, or amateurs, no matter how talented, simply did not exist in the wild in 1987. This and other information we were never able to corroborate is what allows us to free J and K as suspects with full confidence. Rick is continuing to work the theory that he maintained all along, the angle that Max had ties to the local Chicago broadcast community. For my part, this pretty much ends the end of my direct involvement in the case. I'm actually kind of happy about it in a way because at least it frees up the focus of the investigation to move where it appears it should. For what it's worth, we recently obtained a photo of Jay. He seems like a happy, normal, well-rounded adult with a family. A far cry from the off-the-wall character I recall him being 27 years ago when I was a newly minted, nervous 13-year-old at a party. So, Rick and I are both here to answer any questions about the case, at least we were able to, and to talk about where the focus of the investigation is now headed. Cheers.
Max Headroom.
Max Headroom?
Strangely, I was reading your original post last night. I'm just wondering how Jay would have known something big was going to happen on Channel 11 that same night. For all I know, my being told to watch Channel 11 was the equivalent of being told to bug off and go watch Sesame Street or something. That's certainly how it felt at the time, kind of a brush off. The discrepancy between the fact that the original intrusion happened on Channel 9 and not 11 is also one of those things we could never reconcile. It would follow that if they were truly behind it, they would have been telling people to watch Channel 9. This reply is so weird to me, because it is true that the first intrusion happened on Channel 9, but the second intrusion later that night happened on Channel 11. So this is a bad answer to the question, and you may begin to see why this thread is a little suspicious. I'll go into this more as I'm reading the questions and afterwards, but it does seem like this guy's backpedaling quite a bit on his original theory. Oddly enough, after reading original AMA probably 2 to 3 years ago, I finally decided to watch a video of the intrusion yesterday. There's a surprising amount of information that can be extracted from the second intrusion video, even on a frame-by-frame basis. By our count, the incident video contains approximately 30 to 35 individual identifiable properties/characteristics that a given suspect can be compared against. Rick is in possession of a scanline-accurate first-generation SP mode VHS copy of the incident, one donated to the museum. It has proven to be a real treasure trove of data. Now notice the answer he gives here, because he doesn't give anything away that's specific. He says, some are simple, race, gender, and approximate age. Some are more esoteric, such as the type of point lighting used, camera type, even the flooring in the room. Some are very specific identifiers. There are a handful of others that are incredibly specific. Like I just said, he doesn't give anything specific here. He just says, yeah, you can totally tell their race and gender and age and all this other stuff. I promise. And yet he doesn't give anything. What is their race, or their gender, or their age, or if you don't want to do that, talk about some of the more esoteric things. What was the point lighting used? What was the camera type and the flooring? None of those answers are given. Another question says, what technical evidence convinced you that someone on the outside could not have done it? I think people would have said the same things about the phone system at the time, but technical people, phone freaks, were using blue boxes and whistles to make phone calls in the 70s. Social engineering is a powerful tool to get insider info. You've asked a great question, but I'm afraid I have to disappoint you with an intentionally vague answer. That question crosses into an area we prefer not to talk about until the suspect pool is fully depleted. Rick is the one in charge of that bag, and he's not likely to risk letting the cat out at this point. The same information that was useful in ruling out J and K is proving to be equally useful in ruling in other suspects. Feel free to ask him, though along those lines I'm not sure what he considers okay to talk about versus not okay. I should point out that while BPOG says that it would have had to been industry insiders, that's not necessarily true, at least according to an FBI investigator who helped on the Captain Midnight case. He's quoted as saying, I don't think it needed to be expensive. The gear might have cost around $10,000, but it would have been available used on the amateur radio market. There is surplus equipment sold with this capability. I don't think it needed to be a few briefcases. It did need a dish antenna, but if they got close to the STL receiver antenna on the TV transmitter, then a direct TV size antenna might have been adequate.
Normally, I'd say sunglasses are ostentatious.
It's so weird that the original theory was denied this intensely, especially with the incorrect statement about channels. BPOG states, for all I know, my being told to watch Channel 11 was the equivalent of being told to bug off and go watch Sesame Street or something. That's certainly how it felt at the time, kind of a brush off. The discrepancy between the fact that the original intrusion happened on Channel 9 and not 11 is also one of those things we could never reconcile. It would follow that if they were truly behind it, they would have been telling people to watch Channel 9. This statement is just so weirdly worded considering that only the first intrusion was on Channel 9. And the second one, way later that night, was on Channel 11, like they originally stated in the Pizza Hut. Is it so crazy to think that they wanted to test out their capability on a different channel? Or that they changed their mind and went for Channel 9 only to find they couldn't transmit sound, and so they just kind of gave up and went back to their original plan? This really doesn't seem that crazy to me. I mean, it's not like these guys were professionals. They were just doing a bit of trolling. Maybe I'm nitpicking here, but this statement, it just rubs me the wrong way, especially from someone who claims they spent a lot of time investigating the intrusion. It does activate the more conspiratorial-minded part of my brain and makes me wonder, maybe J&K really did have a hand in this. I mean, is it crazy to think that he might have felt bad that people were doing their own private searching and he didn't want their lives interrupted by a bunch of Redditors? There is another bit of evidence, tenuous as it may be. In 2022, someone would privately message Rick Klein and ask him if he ever figured out who did it, to which he would respond, "Basically, we know who it is, but can't say anything until he passes away. Not much else to say other than that, sorry." The profile picture does line up with Rick Klein's Reddit account. Of course, it could be faked, but this is such a weird, tenuous bit of evidence to fake. I just don't see that being very likely. Rick Klein probably does know who did it, or thinks he does. So after all these years, we're still sitting at the same suspects. Either it's J or K, or just some guy who had a grievance with the company. Maybe he was fired, or lost a lawsuit, or who knows. Could have been just someone wanting to do a bit of trolling. If Rick is telling the truth, we might get more news on this story in the coming years when the suspect passes away. Until then, this has been the Max Headroom Mystery. Thank you for watching.